Right, so we looked at the promise methods in the previous video. Without wasting any time, let's just jump into the polyfills starting with Promise.all. So if you notice, all these promise methods return a promise at the end. That's a great starting point for us. I'll create a function, and inside that function, I'll return a promise for now. Since we also pass in a list of async operations to all these promise methods, you can see here that we have an array of async operations. We also need to do the same for our custom method. This is going to be an array of async operations. Now inside this promise, we need to go through each promise and do certain tasks in case the promise gets resolved or rejected. So to iterate through all of these promises, I'll simply use a for each loop. And for each of these promises, I'll have a then block and a catch block. So if my promise resolves, then it's going to execute this block. If it gets rejected, then it's going to execute this block. Now in the previous video, if you remember, the way Promise.all worked is that if all the promises get resolved, then we get an array with the results from each of the promises. But if any of the promises got rejected, then we only got the error back from that rejected promise. So an array of results if all the promises get resolved, and an error if any one of the promises gets rejected. The error part is a no-brainer. I can simply use the reject method here and pass in the error object as it is, and that will be it for the error block. Now for the success block, we need an array wherein we can pass in the result from the promise resolution. So I'll create an array at the top, and inside this array, I'll be pushing the result from each of these promises. Now one final thing that I need is a way to check when all the promises have resolved. If that is the case, then I can simply resolve this outer promise. So I'll create one more variable outside called completed promises. Each time a promise resolves, I'll increment that count. Finally, I'll check if the count is equal to the length of the list, length of these promises list. If yes, then I'll simply resolve passing in this result array. So first, let me increment the count. And at the end, I'll check if promises.length is equal to completed. If that is the case, then I'll simply resolve and I'll pass in the promises result array. So basically, if all the promises inside this list get resolved, then I'll simply use this resolve method on the promise that we are returning. And inside that resolve method, I'll pass in the promises result array. Let me actually copy this, and right below it, I'll also use our custom Promise.all function. It takes in a list of 3 promises. That's what gets passed to this promises parameter. We return a promise, and inside we iterate through the list of promises. The first one will resolve after a second. So it's going to increment this count. It's going to push it inside the result array. It will check if the length of the completed promises variable is equal to the total length. It's not, because we've only resolved one promise. So it's going to move on to the second promise. It's going to resolve it after 3 seconds. It will do the same thing, push it to the result array, increment the count, and again check if the length is equal. Again, it's not going to be equal because it's just 2 promises. It moves to the next promise. It does the same thing. And this time is going to get true as the result for this if block. So it will ultimately resolve this promise by passing in the list of resolved messages from each promise as the result. So if I go back to the browser and I open up the console, you'll see that we get 2 arrays. The first array is from the native Promise.all method, and the second one is from our custom Promise.all polyfill. And you'll see that it gives us the same result in both of these implementations. Now, if for any reason, say the second promise gets rejected, we'll be directed to the catch block and not the then block. So it will go inside here and it will not return this array anymore. It's directly going to reject and give us the error as a response. So let me test this out. I'll reject the second promise. I'll go back to the browser. And now you should see 2 error messages. Both of these error messages are essentially the same. One from the native Promise.all method and the other one from our polyfill. So that's the Promise.all polyfill. Now the next method is the Promise.all.settled. The only difference that we had pointed out between Promise.all and Promise.all.settled in the previous video is that all settled will wait for all the promises to settle. In the case of Promise.all, if any one of the promises in the list gets rejected, we do not get back the response for other fulfilled promises. In the case of all settled, we do get the result back for both resolved and rejected promises. I'll show you what the result looks like. Let me comment this out for now, and I'll change this to all settled. If I go back to the browser, you'll see that we get an array of objects as the response, and for each promise, whether it's fulfilled or rejected, we do get a response back. We do not get an error. In case of fulfilled promises, we get the status and the value. In case of rejected promises, we do get the same thing, but instead of the value, we get the reason for why the promise got rejected. So we also need to somehow come up with a similar response for our polyfill. So I'll minimize this and I'll create a new function. This again takes in a list of promises. Instead of writing the whole thing, let me just copy this entire thing from this polyfill and I'll paste it here. We'll simply choose what we want for this polyfill and get rid of the rest of the things. The first thing that I need to do is rename this variable from completed promises to settled promises, just for more clarity, because as the name suggests, we do not really care about whether the promise gets rejected or resolved. We do want to keep the count of the promises settled, but yeah, we're going to display the result as an object regardless of what happens inside that async operation. So we'll call this variable settled promises and not completed promises. Now inside this for each loop, instead of pushing just the result inside the array, we'll push an object with a status and a value property. The status will be fulfilled and the value will be the result. So I'll convert this into an object. Status is going to be fulfilled and value is going to be the result. Inside the catch block, we won't be using the reject function anymore because this will throw an error and we do not want that. What we want is to get an object with the status as rejected, and instead of value, we need the reason. And the reason is basically going to be whatever we pass inside this reject block. So this message right here. So I'll again push this inside the settled promises array. I also need to change this array here and push an object. The status is going to be rejected and the reason is going to be the error. I need to increment this count. I accidentally named this array as this variable. Should be this thing here. Let me increment the count here and I'll do the same thing inside this catch block. Now this check here, I will need to do this in both the cases, when the promise gets resolved or the promise gets rejected. Because let's say out of this list of promises, the last one gets rejected. So if I have this if condition inside my then block, that means it's never going to get here if my last promise gets rejected. Basically, the first promise is going to go inside this block. It gets resolved. It moves on to the second promise. It's again going to get resolved. It will again increment this count and do everything here. And the final one gets rejected. So it's not going to go inside this block. It will go inside the catch block. So I either need to have this condition in both the then block and the catch block, or I can have a finally block at the bottom, and inside here, I'll move the check. So it's going to run after this promise regardless of whether it gets resolved or rejected. So even if the last promise gets rejected, it's still going to go inside this finally block, and it will check if the promise's length is equal to the number of settled promises, and ultimately it will resolve. So yeah, this looks good. I will now uncomment this, and instead of all, let me set it to all settled. Let's see what we have inside the browser. Ideally, we should get two arrays this time, and both of these arrays should be identical. Yeah, you can see that it's pretty much the same. The second promise got rejected, and that's what we get here. The status as rejected, and instead of value, we get the reason. Now the next method is Promise.race. Now that you've seen the first two polyfill methods, this should also feel very easy to implement. The condition here is that if any promise resolves, you resolve with its result. If any promise rejects, you reject with the result. This is probably the easiest one. I'll again copy the entire thing and let me create the custom Promise.race method. Since we just resolve or reject with the first promise that gets settled, we don't really need the variables here. So I'll get rid of these. Now inside the then block and the catch block, all I need to do is either resolve with the result or reject with the error. It's pretty straightforward. I'll get rid of this finally block. We don't really need it here. Let me just replace this with the resolve result. And inside the error block, it's going to be reject the error. That's it. That's all we need to do for this custom race polyfill. If I now replace this with promise race and replace this polyfill, the custom polyfill for the race method, and go back to the browser, you'll see that we get the first settled promise. So since the fastest promise that we had got settled in 1 second, we got this response back. If I increment this to 4, then we are going to hit this async operation first. So it's going to reject with this message for both of the cases, the native case and the polyfill case. Let me save this and go back to the browser. After 3 seconds, you should see an error message. Yeah, you can see here that we get the same error message for both of these implementations. Now, finally, we get to the Promise.any method. And this one's pretty similar to the Promise.race method. The only difference here is that it will wait for a promise to resolve. If a promise is rejected, it will still wait to see if there's any other promise that gets resolved. The moment it gets one, it will resolve with the result from that promise. So Promise.any will always try to resolve, unlike Promise.race, that simply returns the result from the first promise that got settled. Now, if all the promises are rejected in the case of Promise.any, then we get an aggregate error back that's part of this error object. So if you want to know more about this, you can watch my previous video wherein I show you what this aggregate error looks like. So yeah, let's build our polyfill. So let me copy the all settled polyfill here instead of Promise.race polyfill, because we are going to need some of these variables here. Now let me rename these variables for better understanding. Instead of promises result, I'll call it promises rejected result, because if one of the promises gets resolved, we don't even need to worry about the rejected promises. Even if the last promise gets resolved, it's still going to return the result from that resolved promise. So we only need this array when all the promises get rejected. That's the reason why I renamed this to promises rejected result. I'll also rename this as promises rejected for the same reason. If we land inside the then block, it means one of the promises got resolved. So we can simply take its result and pass it to the resolve function, which in turn will break out of this polyfill. So what I'll do here is get rid of this and resolve with the result. So if I come inside the then block, I simply need to return the result back, and all of this is not going to matter anymore. But if I do land inside this catch block, we'll first track the number of failed promises and push them inside this array. So instead of promises result, I'll change it to promises rejected result. I'll push just the error inside the array, and I'll increment this count, promises rejected count, by 1. And this time I don't really need the finally block. I only need to check this condition if all the promises have rejected. So it's only going to happen inside this catch block and never inside this then block. So I can simply move this inside the catch block. I get rid of the finally block. And inside here, I'll check if the promises rejected length is equal to the promises length. If that is the case, then I first need to create an aggregate error. So let me actually open up a block, and inside this, I'll create a variable called aggregate error. And this is going to be of type aggregate error. And this aggregate error takes in the list of promises that got rejected. So this array. And the second parameter inside this constructor is going to be the message that we want to display. So promises rejected result. And the message that we want to display is all promises were rejected. Finally, I'll simply use the reject method and I'll pass in our aggregate error. So to test this, let me replace this with any, and I'll copy our polyfill here. If I go back inside the browser, you'll see that we get the same response for both the methods. The reason why we are getting this is because I actually changed the timeout value for our fast promise to 4000 milliseconds. So it resolved after 4000 milliseconds. If you see here, after 3000 milliseconds or 3 seconds, the second promise did get rejected. But since one of the promises out of these 3 got resolved, and since this was the first one, it simply returned the result from this promise. Now what I'll do is I'll reject all these promises and let's see what we get. Let me also set this back to 1 second. After 5 seconds, we should get an aggregate error. Yeah, you can see here that we get an aggregate error. All promises were rejected for this native implementation at the top and the custom polyfill implementation at the bottom. So yeah, these were the polyfills for the promise methods from the previous video. If you know what happens in the native API, building these polyfills is not that difficult. Make sure to try these out yourself and see if you can find any edge cases and try to fix them. I've covered quite a few polyfills that are important from an interview standpoint. If you have any more in mind that I may have missed, do let me know in the comments. Also do subscribe to the channel and yeah, I'll see you in the next one.